Okay, we can start. This is just me kind of getting my mind to work again.
So Visual Pleasure is 40, and you've been asked often this year how you came to write the essay. And you've often mentioned that today you see the essay as a document of the politics of its time.
Yes.
Would you like to
Yes.
talk some more about that?
Yes. When I say it's a document, I also want to emphasize that although I wrote it was my ideas and came very particularly out of my conjuncture of experiences, at the same time it was in the air. There was a way in which those ideas, bringing together questions about cinema through, as it were, the lens of psychoanalytic theory and with the politics of feminism, was something which people were interested in. They were all three topics of concern at the time, and perhaps very particularly feminism as a reinvention, as it were, of psychoanalytic theory. And in many ways, I think that that's one of the most important legacies of the essay. Because I have to say, to begin with, that the essay, historically speaking, the essay was really about two things which are now genuinely archaic. We can talk about archaicisms in a moment. One was cinema spectatorship that was primarily, and well, apart from a few people working on film, exclusively to do with sitting in the cinema and watching films in certain conditions. Well, except, of course, television was there, films could be seen on television, but that wasn't really enough of a phenomenon for it to be worth theorizing. Whereas the conditions of spectatorship in the cinema itself, the darkness, looking up at the screen, all the kinds of relationship of the self to the story and to the spectacle that I talk about in the essay were there. So that's the cinema as a place. Secondly, the cinema that I wrote about was exclusively Hollywood cinema of the 1950s studio system, based on the star, and that was, I think, a very important component of my thought. Of course, I, by that time, writing in the early 70s, had as a dream another cinema, an alternative cinema, an avant-garde cinema, which I could think of and articulate, but it wasn't what I knew even then. So both those cinemas, both the place of the cinema is now archaic. The cinema that I was writing about was even then archaic. And there was this new excitement, new sense of possibility coming out of two things, the politics of the women's liberation movement and the kind of theoretical breakthroughs that were going with it, and two, the new cinemas that were arriving from Europe, Godard, Straub-Huillet, the Cinema Novo from Brazil, third cinemas from various different parts of the world, new documentaries, new avant-garde. So suddenly, not only did the cinema of Hollywood, not only did it no longer exist, but it was no longer necessarily a political priority. But it was, to my mind, the cinema to write about, because it was a cinema of spectacle, cinema of romance, a cinema of fetishism, and so it was appropriate for the ideas that I wanted to use. So that's a kind of strange paradoxical situation which really makes me think of that time, the mid-70s or early 70s, mid-70s, as a time of in-betweenness, where things were changing. And I think the essay is rather a phenomenon not only of its intellectual moment, but also of being in between different eras, as it were, to put it rather grandly.
Legacy of the text, I would say, was the original articulation of feminist thinking and psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis wasn't exactly known as a liberating discourse form. And could you talk some more about that?
I first came across Freud in a women's liberation reading group, which has actually been researched and written about quite a lot now. We were reading lots of important theoretical texts by male theorists who we respected, but who, as we saw it, had definite blind spots about the place of women, both theoretically, socially, politically, and so on. But when we came to read Freud and discovered psychoanalytic theory, although we could approach it first in the most practical way, which was that Freud provided a vocabulary for thinking about questions of gender and gendering and how gender is socialized, and also for thinking about sexuality and how sex becomes part of both the consciousness of a society, but also it's unconscious, it's repressed, both in terms of individuals and in terms of a social unconscious as well. And that sense of being able to articulate not so much what this had done to women, but in my case, more what we learnt about a patriarchal unconscious and the society in which women's sexuality was subordinated to male sexuality, and women were signifiers of the erotic, of sexual desire, and so on. So to my mind, it was, in the first instance, liberation into being able to speak, articulate, and name those aspects of patriarchal unconscious which I felt were repressive and oppressive. And that was both through Hollywood cinema and various other studies that I did at the time, and my particular interest in what I called the language of fetishism, and fetishism itself as a signifying system that made itself visible semiotically all over the place. Wherever you looked for it, it seemed to be kind of erupting. So I think it's from that point of view that psychoanalytic theory was important. Also, if you think of the relationship between, say, Freud and Lacan, even in the most straightforward, unsophisticated way, the theorization of the Oedipus complex and the Oedipal trajectory, in some sense, Lacan's very specific way of seeing patriarchal authority coming out of language, culture, the law, and so on, might not have been something that we would be prepared to accept politically, but certainly described the way things were. And if one just looked in any direct way at the history of culture and women's struggle to create, that exclusion and marginality from the centres of cultural making, more or less wherever it was, seemed to be confirmed by the psychoanalytic theory.
You mentioned in the introduction the generational gap between now and your early writing about women and film. Could you talk some more about this generational gap?
I think for some time feminists engaged with film and with media, and particularly when trying to think out of and past heterosexuality and to think of film media in terms of queer theories and getting away from, as it were, the heterosexual box. have found that the ideas that we came up with then was something of a straitjacket. I'm not quite sure if I would agree with this. I also think there's genuinely and always a way in which one generation, as it were, rejects, as it were, what had been before. You know, it's a bit boring to go on saying the same thing as other people had said, 10 years earlier. It's more interesting to try and think as a knight's move, as it were, across and beyond earlier ideas. So I think that sense of a rejection of one by another is very understandable and almost essential. But at the same time, as time continues to pass, and as time kind of goes on, then there might be ways in which the ghosts, as you call it, in your very nice title, might come back to haunt a much younger generation who feels perhaps less oppressed. But what had caught my imagination in when I wrote the introduction to the Feminism's book was the idea that the archaic, and this was an idea I took from an essay of Emily Apter's, the idea of the archaic and the return of the archaic can also challenge our ideas of chronology and linearity and allow us, as it were, to fuse across times and across temporalities. And I thought that was an extremely productive and interesting idea. And as in my, I was going to say recent, but actually it's nearly 10 years ago now, my 2006 book, Death 24 Times a Second, there I was interested in the ghostly nature of cinema and the celluloid medium. So that it seemed to me that the return of ideas as ghostly and as challenging linear temporality was something one could kind of pick up and use in this context.
Because you talk about obsolescence in the title of your introduction.
That's it. Yes.
Sort of a productive
obsolescence. And I think then I was also had in my mind Walter Benjamin's idea of an obsolescence of useful things that can then be rediscovered with new kinds of values and new kinds of usefulness, which isn't necessarily useful, but can be given cultural resonances and new kinds of fascinations and creative, kind of creative value, which they wouldn't have had before. So it was in that sense that I thought obsolescence is an idea that one can kind of keep reviving and keep returning to, even though, of course, it's been a term that's been around and been recycled and revived for a long time.
You acknowledge that the problems of representation that you diagnosed at the time in your essay still persist and are still very much in need of tackling, but you also seem to suggest that the theories of the time are no longer, at least straightforwardly, relevant or useful or effective. Do you concur, or because sometimes these ideas can serve more as inspiration and as a sort of retrospective diagnosis?
Yes.
But are they still?
I mean, it might seem old-fashioned and stuck in the past, but I still think psychoanalytic theory is of enormous use to thinking about questions of gender, and thinking about put it like this: thinking about questions of gender and sexuality, but almost more than that, the idea that there is an unconscious, and that there is a structured unconscious, and that it comes out of the social milieu in which both an individual and a collective psyche nurtured and socialized. And it seems to me that that's worth holding on to. One of the things that's changed so much is, I think, between my generation and younger generation, is that someone like me, born during the war, born in 1941, so then growing up in a country like the UK, which was reinventing itself with a welfare state, and with not necessarily with strong progressive movements in command, but with progressive movements as part of everyday consciousness. Just that things would get better, and we would move towards a better world. People's consciousness would be raised and improved. Whereas what we've actually seen, and I think this is one of the things that's very confusing for now and for younger generations, is backward steps rather than forward steps. And the way in which this might relate to the crisis of the socialist aspiration altogether, in a sense, its defeat in the face of globalization, neoliberalism, etc., means that there's assumptions of progress. Even for people who weren't necessarily on the left, there was still that driving force. Perhaps even to put it in the terms of where were so rejected, the grand narratives which disappeared really very abruptly during the 80s. And although nobody has time for grand narratives anymore, they had a lot of use, and how to rethink movements, as it were, outside the hope that humanity will improve itself rather than decline ethically and economically, is very, very difficult. I think it's a huge challenge to thinking today. Representations through digital technology and much more complex media is another kind of challenge that people have to face today. On the other hand, the exploitation of the body as object of spectacle and object of consumerism not only continues unabated, but has actually exponentially almost exploded. And there's a way in which advertisements, video, fashion videos, pop videos create a disembodied body, a body which has almost, as it were, achieved a lack of materiality alongside the declining sense of materiality of the digital medium itself. It's something that I find very fascinating, but then again kind of represents a new way of trying to think these things through. Also, if you just look at any mode or discourse of advertising, it affects the young male body as well as the young female body. And all those kinds of discourses and discourses of androgyny both might seem to be liberating, but on the other hand also represent the way in which consumer culture is just is very much the linchpin of the way in which people think and relate.
The title of this volume, Feminisms, is this plural
Yes.
also a symptom of the new challenges and of the generational gap between your writings at the time?
Yes, I think so. And one of the important principles of the book, which I evolved with my co-editor, Anna Bachman-Rogers, and in which she was a very important influence, was to try and introduce the ways in which this younger generation might be approaching similar kinds of problems and issues, but from but refracted through new important ideological questions. So, for instance, black consciousness, consciousness of race, lesbian consciousness and the lesbian body, and the retrieval of these lost histories, which are very different, I think, in either case, but are perhaps too complicated for me to go into now. But in both cases, to my mind, involve questions of haunting, regaining a past, and rethinking that past in terms of a present. So always, as it were, folding one epoch and one or a past into a present, and putting them in some dialectical relationship with each other. Also, from a theoretical point of view, I'm sure I'm leaving lots of things out. From a theoretical point of view, I had an interesting conversation with Martine Bonnier, whose work is quite influenced by the new theories of hapticity and the tactile that have emerged recently and have been articulated very much in opposition to the theories of spectatorship, and again very critical of those earlier theories, and I assume mine particularly. I don't actually necessarily see that antagonism as being very valid. I mean, this is partly perhaps because I've always loved the visual. I've never felt terribly strongly that Italian Renaissance perspective was part of bourgeois ideology. However much I think ways of looking are definitely always part of how a subject is actually structured. But there are many ways in which I think that there are ways in which things can be more magical and trompe-l'oeil-ish, as it were, rather than just, as it were, naturalizing of the gaze. So, I mean, all I mean is that I think that these theories can very much be in dialogue with each other if it's worth bringing them together. Though at the same time, I do, as I said at the beginning, realize that to evoke something new, you often have to do so by critiquing something that has been.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Do justice to the title of your essay. Thank you so much. Interesting.
I must write that down. So many people have told me that I should add that to my home movie collection. Yeah. It's spelled P-A-U-L-I.
Double L.
Double L.
E. Como é que se diz Y?
Why?
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 Yeah. Stories we tell.
Stories we tell, that's right. So when I get back, I hope to start seeing lots more films and catching up with lots of things as well.